Sudan's political crisis is escalating after months of protests and deadly crackdowns. U.S. Secretary for Africa Tibor Nagy is heading there this week. He's meeting with Sudan's military council and the civilian opposition.
More than 100 people have died there just within the past week. Many were killed and injured during a sit-in protest last Monday. Sudanese doctors say dozens of people were raped during the brutal military crackdown. Unrest erupted in April after the military ousted Sudan's longtime leader. So for more on this, we want to bring in CBS News correspondent Deborah Pata. She's with us now from Johannesburg, South Africa. Deborah, what is the latest? I mean, I think a lot of people are worried that this country is on the brink of a major civilian unrest and perhaps even more violence.
Absolutely, and that really has been the problem in that country for decades now. They really need some respite after 3 decades of autocratic rule under Omar al-Bashir, and it's been a week of torment for that country. The crackdown which happened last Monday, following this, only now are we seeing details beginning to trickle out of exactly what happened. It would seem that well over 100 people were killed in a single day by paramilitary groups in that country. Doctors say they counted at least 118 bodies, 40 of which were pulled from the Nile River. The government will only admit to 61. Even 61 is a huge, significant death toll in that particular country. Protesters are demanding a swift transfer to civilian rule after Omar al-Bashir was deposed in April, and so far that has not happened. But perhaps what's even more worrying is that horrific details, harrowing details, are now beginning to emerge of rapes that happened during that crackdown. And doctors say they've counted at least 70 cases of rapes of both men and women that happened during that crackdown and in the immediate aftermath. And as for, the potential for civil war, well, right now, the protesters remain bloody, battered, but very defiant, and as of now, committed to nonviolence. Vlad and Marie?
So, Deborah, the protests started before April, right? And they started because people were demanding that Omar al-Bashir step down. The military stepped in and made that happen. But since then, it almost seems like the situation is worse than it was when they were under the power and the influence of a 30-year dictator. Why have things sort of spiraled out of control the way that they have?
It's so ironic, isn't it? I mean, it began with such high hopes. In December last year, there was an economic crisis in Sudan. Al-Bashir's grip on power was slipping. There were rising bread prices and rolling mass action, protesters every single day. And that, as you said, paved the way for the military leaders to step in and demand that Omar al-Bashir step down, ending 3 decades of autocratic rule, including allegations of genocide. This was a very significant moment. And then this bloody crackdown. And it would seem that protesters and the government are engaged in something very different. The protesters are saying they want a swift transfer to civilian rule. The military is clinging to power, and what is very worrying is that they've now deployed a paramilitary group known as the RSF, which actually has its roots in the Janjaweed, a group that has a very terrifying history. They were deployed during the early 2000s in the war in Darfur, and they've been accused before of war crimes, including torture, including rape, and including genocide. And now here they were, formalized under al-Bashir, turning on protesters. Literally just weeks before the crackdown of last week, this very group, the RSF, actually disobeyed orders by al-Bashir to fire on protesters, saying the demands were legitimate. Now they're in power, and they are refusing to uphold those demands and turning on protesters. They say they don't want to rule forever. They're just there for the interim, but they're warning against things like chaos. So this is a very worrying and very troubling sign. Vlad and Marie?
So, Deborah, initially the military said that they wanted to maintain control for 2 years and then they would transfer things over to civilian rule. Is that timeline still in place considering what's happening?
I think it's going to be a very, very difficult road for Sudan. You're quite correct. The military is saying that they want to hold on to power. They've even brought it down a little bit. They could say they could be there as long as 9 months and that an election would then be held. But what the civilian and the protesting groups are saying, that they don't trust that that election would be free and fair. They're worried that it would simply be there to legitimize the appointment of another military ruler. And they point to countries like Egypt, saying that is exactly what happened there in 2014. So they're saying hand over power to civilians right now. Now, in the absence of anything happening there, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has tried to mediate between the groups. There's been peace talks, but those reached an impasse over the fact that civilians are saying they want that transfer to happen right now and as it's happening on the ground. So far, of course, we've seen that whilst there were talks going on, things were smooth, a little rocky, but then that clampdown last week has turned into something very worrying and very troubling indeed for the international community and obviously for the people of Sudan.
So speaking of the international community, Deborah, have we heard at all? I know that there have been some people who have called for the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, to visit Khartoum. Not sure that that's going to happen. You mentioned Ethiopia, but what about some of the other players in the region, for example, Egypt? What are Sudan's neighbors doing to try and bring an end to this?
Well, there's obviously been a widespread condemnation on the bloody crackdown, but there hasn't been, other than that, any formal concrete pushback from the United Nations or Western countries like, say, the United States. The African Union has suspended Sudan's membership and they've called for an end to the violence. As I said, Ethiopia stepped in to try and mediate. But other than that, there hasn't been any real concrete action in the country. As you mentioned earlier, Tibor Nagy, the United States top diplomat for Africa, will fly to Sudan this week. He's expected to call for a cessation of the violence and also to call for a resumption of the peace talks. But one of the most worrying things is that this country and the military rulers in particular of Sudan seem to have both the financial and the political backing of countries like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And for as long as they have that, there isn't any real incentive for them to step down as of now. So that is the very, very worrying situation in Sudan right now. Vlad, Anne-Marie?
All right, Deborah Pata reporting for us from Johannesburg. Thank you, Deborah. Really important story. I'm glad we're able to talk to you about it.